Okay, welcome to the fourth session of our policy dialogue series, 2021 to 2022. This morning, we would discuss the topic of regional integration and economic future, opportunities and threats within Greater Bay Area. This is definitely a very important topic for Hong Kong because one of the promises of one country, two system, as well as the sustainability of a global city is, of course, how to achieve economic development. And regional integration is definitely a very big topic in that context. And well, with a look at regional integration, of course, we need to also look at the broader context. And in this regard, Greater Bay Area is a strategic issue that somehow we have to look into. And this morning, we have three very distinguished speakers with us. On my right side is Professor Anthony Cheung. He is currently our research chair professor of public administration. And of course, Anthony has a very special profile that on one side is an academic, at the same time, he has very rich experience in actual governmental administration. He was Secretary for Transport and Housing in 2012 to 2017. We also have a speaker, Professor Donald Low. He is Professor of Practice with the Division of Public Policy at Hong Kong UST. And thirdly, we have Professor Tang Pei Wai. He is Professor of Economics at the University of Hong Kong, and he is also Associate Director of the Asia Global Institute, the Institute for China and Global Development, as well as the Hong Kong Institute of Economics and Business Strategy at HKU. Three of them would take turn to give presentation on what they have prepared on this meaningful topic of regional integration and economic future. Of course, I would like also, before starting, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers, that is Asian and Policy Studies Department of Education, University of Hong Kong, Division of Public Policy of Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and also the Academy of Hong Kong Studies at EdUHK. Without further ado, I would ask Anthony to kickstart our discussion this morning.
Thank you very much, Dialogue. Let me first of all share my screen. Okay. Now, as Dialogue said, we have a very big topic. And in fact, there are three main subjects. Regional integration, particularly in terms of the Greater Bay Area, and also Hong Kong's economic future. The two are closely related. And so before I talk about the Greater Bay Area issue or the development of the GBA, I would like to first go back to Hong Kong's path of economic transformation, because that's important. Whatever we are talking about today, about the GBA, about other things involving Hong Kong's economic future, we have to look at these prospects within Hong Kong's journey of economic development. Okay, sorry, I think, okay, no. If we look back at Hong Kong, now there are different ways of classifying stages. Here, I'm suggesting that our first economic transformation post World War II, so that's during the 1950s and 60s, we were transforming from an entrepôt to a base of manufacturing industries, and that's important. And that was facilitated by the arrival of industrialists and migrant labor from the mainland of China because of what's happening on the mainland at that time, economic turmoil, political struggles, and other things. So we have new migrants. Some of them came to Hong Kong as refugees. some coming to Hong Kong to seek opportunities. So somehow that created an opportunity for Hong Kong. And Hong Kong's economic takeoff, in a way, because of that. So the real takeoff probably was around the late 1960s and the early 1970s. And then by the later part of the 70s, Hong Kong began to feel the pressure of competitiveness within the region because of higher labor costs, because of other things. And then there was a time when Hong Kong considered industrial diversification. In fact, the government set up a special committee for that purpose. But then at that moment, the mainland began to open up and reform because the Cultural Revolution came to an end. The new leadership tried to find a way out of all the problems created previously. So that gave Hong Kong an opportunity to pursue the second stage of economic transformation. So roughly from the 1980s, when the mainland was pursuing reform, all kind of pilot experiments, not just within, not just in the economic domain, but also in social policy, in public administration as well. And because of economic reform on the mainland, Hong Kong had an opportunity to move our manufacturing activities north, to take advantage of new opportunities, to take advantage of cheaper costs of production, abundant labor, cheap labor. And at that time, the Pearl River Delta region became a supporting base for Hong Kong. And then that allowed Hong Kong to shift the focus of the domestic economy towards the tertiary sector, the financial services, other service industries. So that was the beginning of Hong Kong gradually becoming a financial hub for the region. And then by the 1990s, we were on a par with Tokyo. Before that, Tokyo was the financial center in Asia. So the right opportunity, and then Hong Kong was somehow prepared. And also we felt the pressure of losing competitiveness if we do not change. So there were various factors accounting for Hong Kong's change. And from then onwards, Hong Kong has focused on the financial hub status. And then we also developed other aspects of our economy, aviation, the port. And by around 2010, we at one point for several years, we were the world's largest container port in terms of turnover. We have overtaken all the others. But of course, gradually we were overtaken by Singapore and then Shanghai and so on and so forth. Hong Kong was the role model to mainland cities in economic reforms and in learning from capitalism in the 1980s. So Hong Kong was much treasured, and that was one of the reasons why Beijing decided to have one country, two systems, to allow Hong Kong to continue its prosperity, its contribution to the motherland, so to speak. And then Hong Kong was an effective intermediary connecting China and the world. Hong Kong had this advantage of historical linkage to the West and was the most convenient gateway to China. Hong Kong was not just counting on its domestic economy, but also the extended economy on the mainland as well, and it benefited immensely from national policies in favor of external investments. For a number of years, front shop, back factory was the model in the Pearl River Delta region. And very soon, Hong Kong entrepreneurs, managers, and professionals were all over the country. But then after 1997, I mean, that change in partly was because of political change, but I think, well, somehow by that time, because of the external environment, because of what's happening on the mainland, the rapid economic takeoff on the mainland, somehow after reunification, Hong Kong began to face problems, paradoxes and bottlenecks. And here I've listed a few. In terms of economic importance, you might say that the economic balance has been totally turned around, reversed. Before the handover in 1993, the figure, Hong Kong's GDP was roughly 27% of the mainland GDP, close to 30%. Today is around 2.3 or 2.2. Hong Kong was caught in a new dilemma of growth. Almost a few years after the handover, the mainland economy took off rapidly in the new millennium, and gradually the mainland has found its own way of alternative development. Those cities which used to learn from Hong Kong, Shanghai, Shenzhen notably, they have established their own model, and they were not looking at Hong Kong for their own development. So Hong Kong's relevance to China is becoming more questioned. The Hong Kong port, as I said earlier, was overtaken by other mainland ports. So maybe 20 years ago, we were #1 in the world. Today, I think we are still among the top 10, but we are at the lower end of the top 10. In terms of economic philosophy, we have moved from positive non-interventionism to more proactive government, as articulated by the current administration and also the previous CY Leung administration. However, somehow within the public discourse, or even among business in the business world, somehow people are still under the impression that, well, we have a government which is more not interventionist. So the linkage between government and the economy somehow has not been totally rearticulated. So are we still market-driven? Or in what sense it is market-driven? In what sense the state, the government is playing a part? Hong Kong's economic future, here I'm borrowing the concept by Dialogue and also Stephen Chiu in their book in 2009, the concept of re-embeddedness. We have to embed Hong Kong's economic future in China, expanding and globalizing Chinese economy as a global city of China with competitive advantage. So our question is, are we still global? In what sense? Secondly, what is our competitive advantage? We have a rather paradoxical position. We have to be distinct from the rest of the mainland. In other words, we are not just another Chinese city. At the same time, we have to be close enough to the mainland. We cannot be questioned as to whether we are China's Hong Kong. So how do we position ourselves in this context is very important. And sometimes we face challenge. Right now in COVID, how do we open up to the rest of the world? And how do we open up to the mainland, given the pandemic? As Hong Kong is no longer the role model for the rest of China because of the different social and political environment, and Shenzhen and Shanghai and some other cities seem to be more relevant to other cities on the mainland. So what is so unique about Hong Kong to the nation? Any lasting niche? So we have to reconceptualize our intermediation role. And in terms of economic integration, and here I'm borrowing the analysis by Sun Yanwei, who is a retired professor of economics at Chinese U. Our level of economic development, economic size, and degree of openness compared to the mainland could be quite different. So you have asymmetry there. And that may create problems or potential problems of worsening local income distribution and of mainland market demand, overwhelming supply capacity in Hong Kong in some goods and services. So a third economic transformation is much needed, and we have to know where we stand at the moment. Our financial services, trading and logistics, aviation and shipping, these are advantages, still advantages. If you look at the Greater Bay Area Plan, these are those sectors which are valued by the central government. But these sectors, their future development depend a lot on Hong Kong's connectedness to mainland China. In other words, the idea, the concept of re-embeddedness. If we are not re-embedded in this larger national context, in this larger regional context, maybe our financial services, our aviation, shipping, and other things may not grow as much as we would desire. At the same time, we are having higher production costs, land costs, labor. Hong Kong labor is relatively expensive compared to other parts of Asia and the mainland. Our bureaucratic procedures, well, they are good in terms of due process, in terms of procedural justice, but at the same time, are we streamlining our procedure quickly enough so as to facilitate one-stop services, one-stop solutions? So these are all the issues that we have to face. And falling competitiveness in innovation. Innovation is a keyword today, and we all try to be innovative, smart city, so on and so forth. But are we ready in terms of infrastructure, in terms of our knowledge economy, in terms of our mindset to enter Industrial Revolution 4.0? And if you look at the GBA document, innovation is much emphasized for the GBA's future. So is Hong Kong fitting well in terms of innovation? So doubts and prospects, the basis of re-industrialization. This is an idea introduced by C.Y. Leung in his administration. And I noticed that in the GBA document, this is mentioned. But then the way it is mentioned is the center will support the exploration of re-industrialization. So in other words, what is meant by re-industrialization? We have to be clearer in terms of articulation. Re-intermediation, I've mentioned that. So are we grooming the right productivity? When we talk about promoting productivity, what kind of productivity are we talking about compared to the past? Our market environment, and this is becoming an issue. In the past, Hong Kong was well known for being business friendly, open to the whole world. We welcome talent, we welcome business capital, free flow of information, goods and services, talent. But are we still an open society and a free economy enjoying high political stability after 2019? I use 2019 because of the political trouble, because of what happened afterwards, national security and so on and so forth. So how do we retell the Hong Kong story, given all these changes which are creating, making foreign investors question Hong Kong's future? The impact of global geopolitics. Now, this is something beyond Hong Kong, of course, but how do we respond to such changes and such impact? How do we adapt our strategy to such an impact? We must not underestimate the impact. The US-China rivalry, and then of course now the problem in Ukraine, which is giving rise to a real new Cold War. So how do we react to this global change in terms of our economic strategy? Hong Kong's core strength, is it still there? And what is meant by Hong Kong's core strength? We cannot just recite what we used to be good at, as if this is our Bible. Maybe we were good at all those things according to the Old Testament, but now we need to find a New Testament, still the Bible, but how do we tell this new story, given the changes in the circumstances in the background? And historically, Hong Kong's comparative advantage lies in its location and its people. We were noted for being an outlier. We are not at the center, but we are an outlier. We are daring. We are an adventurer. 敢為天下先. This is the term used on the mainland. So are we still having that kind of daringness, willing to change, willing to try new things, willing to experiment? We are not so risk averse, even after 2019. Now comes the GBA. I'm not talking about the details of the document. I just want to highlight the importance of GBA. GBA is very important in two ways. First, as part of China's regional development strategy. Secondly, as sort of a turning point, an opportunity for Hong Kong's turnaround, for Hong Kong's third transformation. Of course, there are also potential threats to Hong Kong's position. If we look at the GBA document, I just highlight some key points. In terms of foundation, why GBA can work. These are what is mentioned in the official document issued in February 2019. Distinctive geographical advantages, robust economic strength for the GBA as a whole, Hong Kong, Macau, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and other cities in Guangdong, high concentration of key factors of innovation. Notice, innovation is the key word. Advanced level of internationalization. Again, internationalization is the key word. So the first I, innovation. The second I, internationalization. And this is important because if we want GBA to work, if we look at Hong Kong's contribution, potential contribution to GBA, internationalization, globalness of Hong Kong, and solid cooperation foundations. Now, challenges. And I'm quoting directly from the wording of the document. Of course, the document is in Chinese, but the Hong Kong SAR government has provided a courtesy translation of that. And here I'm using the sort of courtesy translation. And what is said in the document, in my view, is very frank admission of what we're good at and what we are, what kind of challenges we are facing. Now, according to the document, the global economy is beset with uncertainty and instability, as well as the rise of protectionism. The economic development of the Greater Bay Area also confronts issues such as overcapacity and the imbalance and mismatch of the supply and demand structure. The endogenous impetus for economic growth has to be strengthened. Of course, this is not about Hong Kong or just about Hong Kong. It's also about other cities on the mainland, about Shenzhen, about the other 9 cities in Guangdong. But these are the issues, limitations or constraints that the GBA as a whole has to overcome. Second point, under the one country, two systems arrangement, Guangdong, Hong Kong, and Macau have different social systems and legal systems. They are separate customs territories. Market connectivity needs to be further improved, and an efficient flow of factors of production has yet to be attained. There remains a relatively wide development gap within the Greater Bay Area, and coordination and compatibility will need to be strengthened. Homogeneous competition and mismatch of resources exist in certain regions and sectors. Now, these are the limitations or the challenges. And these limitations and challenges will bring me later on to my other slide about the 3C, compatibility, complementarity, and also connectivity. The third point from the document in terms of challenge, continuous economic growth in Hong Kong lacks sustainable and stable support. Now, this is the shortcoming of Hong Kong, according to the document. And then there are also other cities are also commented upon. For example, Macau is relatively homogeneous with limited resources of development. And then for other cities, the other 9 PLD municipalities, the market economy structure calls for improvement. Regional development faces various bottlenecks, including growing constraints and resources and energy supplies, escalating pressure on ecology and the environment, and a gradual reduction in the demographic dividend. Okay. So these are the challenges. In other words, GBA is an opportunity for Hong Kong and also for other parts of Guangdong, but at the same time, we cannot overlook the challenges, the constraints. In terms of strategic positioning, 5 points are highlighted in the report, in the document: vibrant world-class city cluster, globally influential international INT hub, important support pillar for the Belt and Road Initiative, showcase for in-depth cooperation between the mainland and Hong Kong and Macau. And this is important. This phrase is important. It looks rather plain, but this is the whole basis for supporting the longer term prospect of one country, two systems. And then quality living circle for living, working, and traveling. And some objectives are set in the document. For example, by 2035, it is hoped that GBA should become an economic system and mode of development mainly supported by innovation, with its economic and technological strengths vastly increased and its international competitiveness and influence further strengthened. So these are the keywords. Now, I'll move very quickly because of time. Now, we have also to note that GBA is part of China's national regional development strategy. We have gone through 3 phases for China in terms of regional development. Of course, under the centrally planned economy until reform and open up, there, in a way, there was a balanced development strategy because everything was planned. And then came the reform and opening up. So for a period from until the mid-1990s, somehow there was imbalanced economic development because of this opening up, liberalization, more chaotic at the beginning. And then gradually, the central government came to realize that it's important to have coordinated regional development. And then there are major regions now identified. I won't go into detail. You can look up the literature. And but despite the efforts made, despite all the achievements so far, China's coordinated regional development still faces problems such as unbalanced economic growth between the southern part and the northern part, great gaps in innovation capacity among regions, difficulties ensuing equitable access to basic public services, and slow growth of the blue economy. The blue economy refers to shipping, maritime, and also aviation. In fact, this is also mentioned in the GBA document. So where and how can Hong Kong contribute? In my view, certainly we can contribute to the blue economy and also innovation, financial services. So the 3 questions I would like to raise, first of all, a mentality issue. Whether we in Hong Kong regard Hong Kong as part of GBA or as if outside GBA. Most of the time, I find that our articulation, our discourse seems to suggest that we regard Hong Kong as outside GBA. So we are trying to integrate with the GBA. In fact, Hong Kong is part of the GBA. Hong Kong is one of the most important parts of the GBA. Hong Kong should be an engine of development of GBA. So it is a test between of Hong Kong's vibrancy and transformative capacity within the GBA. Otherwise, we'll be marginalized. We could be either of the 2 sides of the same coin. We could become proactive leader or a reactive compliant follower. We could be an innovator, a social and economic engine, or we could just be adapting to a GBA defined by others within the GBA. So these are the challenges. Is Hong Kong's cosmopolitanism and internationalization still an advantage? In what way? Does the central government still have confidence in Hong Kong taking up a leading role in the GBA? Remember, the document was promulgated in early 2019, before all the troubles began. So after, a few years from then, today, when we look at Hong Kong, to what extent is Hong Kong still enjoying the trust, the confidence of Beijing in taking up the role given to Hong Kong? Regional integration subject to the 3 C's: compatibility, complementarity, and connectivity. And GBA is only worthwhile, it's 9 + 2, 9 Guangdong cities, including Shenzhen, and then 2 Hong Kong and Macau. If we are added together, we could become more than 11. This is what we need to look for. We have to be complementary to each other. What can Hong Kong offer the GBA? Niche areas, expertise, outlook, institutional vibrancy, and most important for Hong Kong, our vision. Hong Kong in GBA, Hong Kong in China, Hong Kong in Asia, and the world. Now, I tried to move fast. I skip a slide, and then I come to this final slide, a relaunch of Hong Kong. I think I've mentioned enough about the transformation, integration to be integrated with Hong Kong's best. So if you're best in financial services, business, trading, professional services, social services, how can integration, innovation be integrated with all these good aspects of Hong Kong? A critical value to a rising China. Two keywords: critical. It's not just any value, but critical to China as well. China is rising. A rising China, of course, has good prospects. At the same time, there are problems. So how do we deal with that? We have to be careful not to undermine the institutional strength of Hong Kong. Our leading role in GBA, I must emphasize the word leading. We are not just reacting to what's happening in other parts of GBA. And while we're giving emphasis to GBA, we must not forget Asia. I think the positioning of Hong Kong as Asia's world city at the beginning of the post-97 period is still important. So don't forget ASEAN. Hong Kong is very important in terms of, it's very important to Hong Kong in terms of our linkage with ASEAN. Our global city, our globalness must not be minimized. And we have to reinvent our intermediate role. I think we still have a very important intermediation role to play, but we have to re-articulate, we have to reinvent the substance of that intermediation. So maybe I'll stop here, and then if time allows later on, I'll come back to some of the points I've not been able to mention here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. You have covered a lot of points, and I'm sure that we will come back to some of them and further engage in the agenda that you have already posed to us. When you mentioned about ASEAN and Hong Kong as an Asia world city, I immediately think about Professor Donald Lowe's expertise and also, of course, the topic that he's going to cover in this presentation. With his expertise, familiarity with Southeast Asia and so on, this would definitely offer some very insightful comments on how Hong Kong would be able to connect not only with China and Greater Bay Area, but also with the rest of the world, with a particular focus on Southeast Asia. So without further ado, Professor Lowe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Liu. And thank you very much, Anthony, for inviting me to speak. So I thought I'll talk about how Hong Kong can position itself as the gateway of the Greater Bay Area to Southeast Asia. This is based on a couple of reports that my institute, the Hong Kong University Science and Technology Institute for Emerging Market Studies, with the support of EY, we did a couple of reports last year, in the middle of last year. So the first report was on how Hong Kong, alongside its integration into the Greater Bay Area, should, as Anthony was emphasizing, maintain its distinctiveness. So you have to balance between integration and differentiation. Hong Kong's value to the Greater Bay Area is so much greater if it is able to differentiate itself, to ensure, enhance and maintain its distinctiveness. This is not rocket science. This is what economists have always emphasized. The theory of comparative advantage says that you will do a lot more trade with one another if you are complementary. If you are alike, what's the point of trading? Right? What's the point of integrating? Right? The benefits of integration are much greater if you have complementary strengths. So that first report, we emphasized the importance of not just integration, but differentiation of Hong Kong's capabilities and its economic structure vis-a-vis the rest of the Greater Bay Area. The second report we emphasized one particular area where Hong Kong already is distinct from the Greater Bay Area, and it is the fact that Hong Kong has a much longer history of close economic relations and a position as a financial and business hub for Southeast Asia, whether it's the hub for raising capital for Southeast Asian companies, whether it's the source of FDI into Southeast Asia, Hong Kong has a much longer and bigger role in that vis-a-vis the rest of the Greater Bay Area. So what I'll do for the rest of the presentation is briefly summarize the two reports. So the first, let me start with the big picture. And the big picture is this. The big picture is that globalization is slowing. Post-global financial crisis in 2008, you've seen not quite a reversal of globalization, but you've seen a slowing of globalization. So ASEAN plus 3 would refer to the Southeast Asian economies plus China, Japan, and South Korea. So that reversal, or not quite reversal, but that slowing of globalization has been observed in ASEAN plus 3 economies too, which means that, you know, which before the global financial crisis, growth as a percentage of global GDP, or in the case of ASEAN plus 3's GDP, trade as a share of that was increasing, right? But post-global financial crisis, it hasn't really been increasing and may even be on a downward trend. So this is what some people call deglobalization. I think deglobalization makes the point. I don't think globalization is going into reverse, but I think it is certainly the case that globalization will take on much more regional characteristics. There's going to be a lot more regionalization and localization. And of course, COVID has, to a large extent, accelerated that trend, right? Because of the disruptions to global value chains, particularly in the last couple of years. And you can see that also within Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong's international engagement has kind of tapered off, whether you look in terms of Hong Kong's exports of goods and services, or Hong Kong's outward FDI as a percentage of GDP. It's still growing, but growing at a much slower pace. In the case of exports of goods and services, it's actually come down slightly. And of course, as Anthony was emphasizing, there is no doubt that Hong Kong would benefit hugely from integrating into the Greater Bay Area. Right? It gives us a lot more opportunities in the existing areas that Hong Kong already has a comparative advantage. Logistics, trade, finance and business services, insurance and other parts of the financial industry. There is no doubt that as Hong Kong becomes more integrated into the Greater Bay Area, it will offer significant growth opportunities. At the same time, based on the experience, so in the first report that I talked about just now, we looked at examples of other small economies or other relatively small economies and how their integration, so whether it is some of the smaller European economies integrating into the European Union or Singapore's role in ASEAN, how regional integration also creates risk exposures, right? Creates heightened certain risks and possibly threats as they become a more integrated part of larger regional economies. First, as we all know, firms and talent may leave for better opportunities in the larger markets. As already happened in Hong Kong, the hollowing out of the manufacturing sector, shown in this dark blue line. The yellow line here shows manufacturing as a share of GDP in Singapore. And the gray line shows that trend in selected small advanced economies. When I say small, I mean less than 8 million people, or maybe less than 10 million people. So as you can see, Hong Kong has been unusual in the almost complete hollowing out of the manufacturing sector since the reform and opening period in the mainland. And of course, loss of manufacturing reduces opportunities for technology upgrading, for technology transfers, for technology development more generally. And as Anthony was mentioning, the upshot of all this is a less diversified economy that is more exposed to sector-specific risks, right? For instance, if there's a global financial downturn or global financial crisis, Hong Kong is particularly vulnerable to these sector-specific risks because it's got almost all its eggs in the services basket. And as I mentioned earlier, the hollowing out of manufacturing has also reduced opportunities for I&T in Hong Kong. R&D as a percentage of GDP among small economies is the lowest in Hong Kong. Of course, there are certain unique features of Hong Kong that explain this. For instance, the fact that Hong Kong doesn't have a defense sector, right? R&D spending oftentimes is correlated with how large your defense sector is. Hong Kong doesn't have that, so it's not surprising. But even putting that aside, right? Hong Kong's R&D spending is relatively low by the standards of rich, advanced, small economies. You would also expect, right, given Hong Kong's history as a very entrepreneurial, dynamic, vibrant, creative city, that it would do better when it comes to being a good place for startups. Right, so this is a well-known global startup ecosystem report, and Hong Kong doesn't rank, its ranking is quite mediocre, right? Obviously, it's behind Silicon Valley, New York City, London, but it is also behind Asian cities like Beijing, Singapore, Seoul, right? Bangalore in India, Hangzhou. So it's really quite mediocre. I don't think 29th is terrible, but it is certainly not something to be satisfied with. And again, another indicator of Hong Kong's weak innovation capacity is this Bloomberg's study of the 60 most innovative economies of the world. So sometimes it is said that Hong Kong lacks scale, right? It's a relatively small economy, and so it cannot be innovative. But if you look at the top 10 most innovative economies of the world, eight of those 10 are economies of about comparable size to Hong Kong's, right? So you look at places like Sweden or Finland, Denmark, right? The population is not much larger, or even in some instances smaller than Hong Kong's. Israel is of a comparable size to Hong Kong. So Singapore, which ranks second, is actually a smaller economy than Hong Kong. So there's really no reason why Hong Kong cannot be a much more innovative economy, and in so doing become a much more valuable part, right? There's a lot more complementarities with the rest of the Greater Bay Area. So maybe I'll sum up the first report, which argues that unless Hong Kong enhances its distinctiveness, right, its differentiation, there is meaningful risk of a further loss of economic activity and an erosion of competitive strengths in key sectors. At the same time, there's substantial opportunities from Hong Kong's integration with the GBA. And in fact, the more successful Hong Kong is in upgrading the distinctiveness of its economy, the more it can exploit the opportunities from GBA integration. And I would argue that only by doing the former well, right, by doing this, enhancing its distinctiveness, can Hong Kong fully realize the benefits of integration. So then the second report we had was to highlight one major way we think Hong Kong can enhance its distinction and enhance its differentiation. And that is to be even more embedded or even more closely integrated into Southeast Asia and to play a part in Southeast Asia's economic development that we think will happen in the next 20, 30 years. Southeast Asia, I think, is on the cusp of a second surge of economic growth. The first was in the late 80s and early 90s, up to the Asian financial crisis. And then after that, investment spending, growth rates tapered off. But we think coming out of the pandemic, Southeast Asia would see a strong rebound and would be, we see a further surge in FDI, in attracting FDI, not least because of the pressures for reducing reliance on China-based global value chains. A second reason is that Southeast Asian economies are ramping up their infrastructure spending. Third, most of their governments are pursuing quite far-reaching supply-side reforms, whether it's labor market reforms, whether it's reforms to investment laws, and as a result, they're attracting more FDI. Fourth, countries in the region, probably Southeast Asia is the only region in the world that is still keen on free trade agreements, that's still very bullish about attracting foreign investments, whether of Western foreign investments or Chinese foreign investments. Southeast Asia doesn't want to choose, right? It wants to welcome investments, technologies from both China as well as the West. And that's most obviously the case with RCEP. By the way, Hong Kong is not yet a member of RCEP. So RCEP is essentially a free trade agreement, quite a comprehensive free trade agreement between the ASEAN economies, China, and South Korea and Japan. So another factor I think that's driving a lot more interest in Southeast Asia has been this not quite reshoring away from China, but this tendency, this drive by companies to build more resilience, to ensure more diversity of supply. And I think this drive has increased pace. It started with, I think, with the US-China trade war, which got companies thinking about, how do we make some of this shift so that we are not so exposed to this trade war. And then, of course, the pandemic has heightened that, right? Companies, I think resilience now is a key motive in companies' investment decisions. Not quite moving operations out of China because China is too big a market for that, but building some spare capacity. So McKinsey did this study, what were companies doing to build resilience? And you look at some of the things, dual sourcing of raw materials. Southeast Asia is a huge source of raw materials. That alone would drive a lot more investment interest in Southeast Asia. Second, nearshoring, right? Moving production or facilities to nearby locations outside of China, for instance. Regionalizing supply chains, right? So not just so dependent on supply chains centered in China, and having backup production sites. So these are some of the main replies. And you see that with these responses, Southeast Asia is likely to be a winner, right? Likely to attract more of these investments as a result of companies' desire to ensure diversity and resilience of supply. Likewise, in 2020, 2021, so this is done by Obis Cross Border and the Emerald Bank. And they looked at what companies have announced in terms of relocation. So in terms of manufacturing, ASEAN is a big, right? Likely to attract a lot more manufacturing investments, even sales offices. ASEAN is going to do regional headquarters. Look at that, right? This is something which Hong Kong used to, what was the major source of investments, regional headquarters. ASEAN is becoming very competitive with data center and customer contact centers. Round up some of the advantages in ASEAN. And then this is done by the Asia Regional Integration Office of the Asian Development Bank. And they looked at to what extent, if companies do decide to relocate their global value chains out of China, or not just out of China, but look to relocate their global value chains, which of the locations are most attractive, right? Where would they consider? So green would be highly attractive. If it's deep red, it is highly unattractive. So you look at Southeast Asian economies like China, Malaysia, even Indonesia and Thailand, relatively attractive for transferring, for companies to transfer or to relocate their global value chain. Finally, some charts on Hong Kong's relations with Southeast Asia. And in particular, I would like to highlight, Hong Kong's re-exports from ASEAN, right? This is re-exports through Hong Kong, right? So from mainland China to ASEAN, this is the red line, and from ASEAN through Hong Kong to mainland China, that's the blue line. So you can see for both, there's been an upward trajectory. Of course, this downward turn here in 2020 was due to the pandemic. So as I said, Southeast Asia is really on the cusp of an acceleration in economic growth, I think for the next 20 to 30 years, and Hong Kong can benefit from that as well, alongside its integration with the Greater Bay Area. So all these supply-side reconfigurations that I was describing earlier would spur investments in Southeast Asia as multinationals seek lower cost locations, as well as pursue a China plus one strategy. I don't think multinationals would relocate out of China entirely. China is simply too large and still a growing economy for that. So, but they would increasingly pursue a China plus one strategy. So who is the most likely contender for that plus one? And I think it's going to be Southeast Asia. Not any particular Southeast Asian economy, but different sectors, different industries would find different parts of Southeast Asia attractive. So it will be places like Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and even Philippines, which for a long time was considered uninvestable. And finally, another reason we should be bullish about Southeast Asia is the fact that it is a major market in its own right. It's a population of about 600 million people. It's going to be the 5th largest. If you treat Southeast Asia as a single economy, it's already the 5th largest economy in the world. Right? Now, let me end by saying something about everything I presented is quite commonsensical, right? There's no rocket science here. It is what most economists you speak to, most analysts who study Hong Kong's role would agree with. Right? I mean, everything I've said here is broadly aligned with what Professor Cheong mentioned. So what's holding Hong Kong back? And I think Professor Cheong started the discussion. I think COVID has dealt a huge blow to Hong Kong's positioning. I think COVID has dealt a huge blow to Hong Kong's position, not because of COVID itself, but because of the Hong Kong government's response to COVID. For instance, I've been arguing since August last year that it was time for Hong Kong to start adapting to a world where COVID will become endemic. It's not going anywhere. It cannot be eliminated. And this Omicron wave could have, if the Hong Kong government had prepared for that, had planned for that, had anticipated the inevitability of COVID becoming endemic, this current wave could have been the opportunity for Hong Kong to start living with the virus and to start, as Singapore has done, right? Singapore during its Delta wave in October last year decided that it was time to start living with the virus because vaccination levels across the population were quite high, above 80%. And so you look at how Singapore has come up more strongly during this particular wave, right? It's attracting a lot more investments this year. Talent, right, are fleeing from Hong Kong to Singapore. If Hong Kong had done something like that beginning in the second half of last year, there was no reason that Hong Kong could not have emerged stronger from COVID-19. It didn't do that, right? Instead, the Hong Kong authorities were fixated on this impossible goal called zero COVID at a time when the rest of the world, not least Singapore, not least other global competitors, other global cities that were Hong Kong's rivals, was reopening borders. But this fixation may do long-term damage to the Hong Kong economy. For instance, I've been back in Singapore for 3 weeks, and I've been overwhelmed by how many fellow Hong Kongers are here, expats, Hong Kongers themselves, mainlanders, mainland Chinese who have fled Hong Kong to Singapore. And I speak to Singapore officials and I tell them, it's really quite silly for Hong Kong to still be so fixated on this zero COVID. And you know what my Singapore colleagues tell me, my ex-colleagues in government, and you know what they tell me? Please don't say anything about the unsustainability or the stupidity of zero COVID in Hong Kong, because they will quote Napoleon, never interrupt a rival when he is making a mistake. That is what my ex-Singaporean colleagues, so they're actually laughing at Hong Kong. And thank you for giving us this subsidy, right, by pursuing this stupid policy of zero COVID. Third, zero COVID in Hong Kong, as we all know, has not minimized deaths and severe illness in Hong Kong. Its current COVID mortality rate, right, of more than 30 COVID deaths per million people, it's not just the highest in the world. It's also higher than the peak mortality rates in almost all Western cities, when they didn't yet have vaccines. So this argument that Hong Kong's high COVID mortality rate is only due to low vaccination among the elderly is wrong, right? The high mortality rate is so high that it is currently higher than what it was in other cities when they didn't have vaccines. So this is quite inexcusable. It shows the lack of investment and preparedness in Hong Kong's public healthcare system for a big wave. So yes, Hong Kong's elderly vaccination rate is shamefully low. It is also the case that its public healthcare system was not adequately prepared, not sufficiently resourced, possibly because of this sense of hubris, right? This misplaced confidence that its zero COVID policy is going to keep out the virus forever. And finally, Hong Kong's zero, and this is why I worry about Hong Kong's economic ability to reinvent itself economically. Right? The zero COVID stance reveals the short-termism, the myopia on the part of government, and the long-standing inability to anticipate, right? To anticipate what's coming up on the horizon, whether it's threats, economic opportunities, and basically inability to adapt to how the environment is changing. So on that rather pessimistic note, why don't I end and hand over the time back to Professor Lee. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Low. For this very, very important presentation. There seems to be a bit of echo on my side, so I better keep myself short. And so I'd like to introduce Professor Tang Hei Wai. Anthony mentioned about reindustrialization, and Hei Wai has just done several projects, I think, on this issue. And I'm sure that you would have something very insightful to share with us. So again, without further ado, Professor Tang.
Thank you, Professor Lui, for the kind introduction. And the benefit and also the cost of being the last speaker, especially after the great presentation by Professor Chang and Professor Low, is that I don't have much more to add. First of all, I agree with everything they said, like literally everything they said, especially Professor Low's comment about Hong Kong's government unpreparedness for the upcoming health crisis that we are still experiencing now. So that is actually good for me because I do have like 10 slides about the background of the Hong Kong's economy and the headwinds that the economy is facing. So I'm going to go through the first 10 slides really quickly because they are largely consistent with what you have already seen in the first two presentations, and then I'm going to be very provocative and try to answer some of the questions bravely raised by Professor Zhang. Okay, and obviously, I look forward to the Q&A. So first of all, we know the world has been going through some economic troubles even before the Ukrainian crisis and the US-China trade war. It has been deglobalizing for a while. I use this word deglobalizing instead of something that is more low profile, because I think compared to what the world has experienced in the 20 years since the mid-80s, global trade has been growing at a much lower rate. And if you look at this ratio, which is a ratio between global exports to global GDP, it has stayed at around 30% since 2008. All right, so you have already heard about the reasons and the challenges for Hong Kong due to that from Professor Low's presentation. But let me remind you about one obvious thing, that is, Hong Kong has been taking advantage of the dividends coming from hyperglobalization passively, I would say, right? I don't think, there is plans, to engage Hong Kong as a middleman of this hyperglobalizing world. And, when there's so much peace and globalization dividends, given Hong Kong, in some sense, free market approach, it would naturally benefit from both, right? So, for example, since the establishment of the People's Republic of China all the way to China's opening up in the 90s, Hong Kong has been playing two major roles. First, as a bridge between mainland China and the rest of the world, and second, as a trade intermediary for mainland China. Since mid-90s, when Deng Xiaoping made the southern trip to Shenzhen, declaring reopening up the Chinese economy and speed up trade and FDI liberalization, Hong Kong has been playing a major role as the intermediary for foreign direct investment into China. And since the global financial crisis, China started to be more outward-oriented in its economic engagement. So Hong Kong has played the role as the gateway for China to go out, right, in terms of trade, but also in terms of China's investment abroad. Okay, so we're going to talk about Belt and Road and RCEP later, but I want to mention one thing, right? There is huge benefits to be, on autopilot and not to be interventional and just allow Hong Kong to be great. But there's this silent cost for Hong Kong's people and also for the Hong Kong economy in the long run. So let me show you just a few charts to sort of pinpoint, the main sort of rationale for my argument. So if you look at FDI into Hong Kong in 2003, most of it is coming from the United States. And it may be the Disneyland effect, and it is true that a lot of the investment into Hong Kong around those time is mostly in telecommunication and entertainment. Fast forward to 2018, the last year that I still have access to this data set, which is from Financial Times, you see that most of the FDI into Hong Kong is from mainland China. So this is part of the going out, Hong Kong helping mainland Chinese investors and firms to invest abroad, right? To in ASEAN, in Belt and Road Initiative countries, and probably in Europe and in the US as well. In terms of the sectoral composition of the FDI into Hong Kong 2003, as I have said, it's mostly in leisure, entertainment, and communication, which are still good, right? Those kind of investment create jobs and enhance Hong Kong's brand. People know Hong Kong as a Disneyland, as well as improving the infrastructure in Hong Kong. Fast forward to 2018, the kind of investment going into Hong Kong is mostly into the real estate sector, into the transportation sector, to finance, right? So this kind of investment is actually making Hong Kong even more specialized in the traditional industries, right? The so-called four-pillar industries. But if you look at the four-pillar industries, those industries that have been cheer-led and supported by the Hong Kong government until recently, they don't talk about these four-pillar industries anymore. They were actually largely in decline, right? So if you look at the share of GDP, it has stayed at around 60% of Hong Kong's GDP, right? So by the way, I should define what are the four-pillar industries, meaning financial service, retail, accommodation, and food, professional service, as well as obviously trade and logistics. With the exception of finance or finance-related services, basically the shares of the four pillar industries in Hong Kong's GDP has been declining. This is also true if you look at employment share. The only growing industry of the four pillar industries is finance, which accounted for around 8% of Hong Kong's workforce. So, this is alarming, right? When we think that Hong Kong still has the four pillar industries, in fact, they have been in decline even before COVID hit Hong Kong, right? I don't think trade, logistics, as well as tourism are going to go back to the pre-COVID status for Hong Kong. This is the slide showing you Hong Kong's as a trade hub in the world. In 2000, Hong Kong's Kwai Chung container terminal was ranked number one in terms of volume of trade. It has declined to number 7 behind Shanghai, Singapore, Ningbo, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Busan. This number for 2018, I just checked this morning before the presentation, it has slipped to number 9 already. So of course you can argue, well, Hong Kong as a trade hub doesn't need to handle trade physically. It can be a logistic and supply chain management hub, but I don't think Hong Kong is taking the opportunity to be leading in those areas as well. Part of the reason is because there have been a lot more trade between China and the other countries in the world directly without going through Hong Kong. Hong Kong used to play a very important role to re-export Chinese goods, and you can simply say it's just rubber stamping, qualifying the quality, certifying the quality of some of the products, as well as adding some values to some of the products. So if you look at the re-export markup, which is essentially the price of the goods, the price difference of the goods coming in, and the price of the goods after being re-exported to Hong Kong, used to be a 50% markup, and now it has declined to only 20%. Right? Simply put, if a good coming into Hong Kong at 10 RMB, used to be 15 RMB leaving Hong Kong to the third country, and now it was only 1.2 RMB. Right? So you have to ask, what happened to Hong Kong trade industry? Are they not adding value on their re-export activities? So a famous labor economist at MIT, David Alter, has studied a phenomenon called the hollowing out of the middle class in the United States around 10 years ago. And no one has studied this for Hong Kong. And 2 years ago, I gained access to the Hong Kong population census data. So I thought, let's just essentially replicate what David Alter did for the US for Hong Kong. And then I realized exactly the same phenomenon of the Hong Kong workforce, right? So, what I did is simply categorize occupations into 3 groups, high-paying jobs, middle-paying jobs, and the low-paying jobs. What you see is that 2 things, right? So the labor demand for the middle-income jobs have been declining, right? Since 2000 all the way to 2016, the last year that we still have the population census data for Hong Kong. On the other hand, the low-paying jobs and the high-paying jobs in terms of labor share have been rising, right? So I don't have to explain to you what are the high-paying jobs, basically, finance and finance-related service jobs. And then if the low-income jobs, those are the security guards, the waiters and waitresses, the cleaning staff, and all sort of low-skilled and low-paying jobs have been on the rise in terms of the share of Hong Kong's labor market, right? So when everyone said, well, Hong Kong is, the international finance hub, and we have a great potential to be the innovation center in the world, I'm actually quite worried about the kind of talents that we have, right? So we still have a lot of talent in finance and finance-related services, like in the insurance industry and the legal professions. But I think a lot of people were essentially slipping down from the middle income paying jobs to the low income paying jobs. And those low income paying jobs, not only that they pay very low salaries, but it promises very low upward mobility, right? Once people slip to that category, it's very hard for them to come out. Not to mention that, their low motivation and the low job satisfaction will also pull down Hong Kong's long-run productivity growth. All right, so let me summarize, the negative descriptions about Hong Kong's economy before I give you some hope and hopefully some optimism. So first, these are the 8 headwinds that the Hong Kong economy is facing. You probably have heard of all of them even before today's panel. First, it has high income inequality and wealth inequality, probably the highest in the world in terms of wealth inequality. Second, Hong Kong is facing globalization and de-intermediation, right? The role as a middleman is going to be much more difficult to play. Third, Hong Kong has been too dependent on finance and related services, which had created only around 8% of high-paying jobs. Fourth, Hong Kong has very low labor mobility, obviously not within Hong Kong, but between Hong Kong and the rest of the world. Fifth, scientific research has not been commercialized due to incomplete ecosystem, which is the point that I will repeat when I try to explain why Hong Kong needs to be reindustrialized. Sixth, the changing geopolitical landscape has been, putting Hong Kong in a very difficult position. And I agree with Professor Low that I don't think Hong Kong's government and politicians are ready for those ongoing geopolitical changes, and they don't know how to reposition Hong Kong during this turmoil. Seventh, the post-pandemic normal. I don't know how we can still attract tourists to come, and I don't know how the trade and logistic hub can continue to be an important pillar for Hong Kong's economy. And finally, obviously, we are still having a shortage in housing in the foreseeable future. All right, let me be provocative and offer some suggestions and try to answer some questions raised by the previous 2 panelists. First, I want to bring you back to the 90s, and I think Professor Lui has participated in one of these projects. In the mid-90s, some Hong Kong elites basically invited 2 groups of economists and professors to give suggestions to the next Hong Kong government, right? The one under Dong Jianhua, right? So one group decided to invite 8 professors from MIT to talk about, Hong Kong's challenges and, what they need to do in order to transform its economy, right? They were already talking about the 3rd economic transformation in 1996. So at the end, those suggestions were summarized in a book called Made by Hong Kong, right? So one of the authors now is actually the president of MIT called Raphael Reif. And he's a nuclear scientist, by the way. And if you look at on the left-hand side of the slide is another project sponsored by another group of elites, headed by a Hong Kong U professor in the business school, by the way, called Michael Enright. And the title of the book is called Hong Kong Advantage. So I'm not going to give you the details because of time constraint, but let me tell you the gist of the 2 books. Right. So basically, one-line summary of the Hong Kong Advantage is that Hong Kong is great. It just has to tell a better story. The government doesn't need to do anything, period. And then the 8 MIT professors said, according to the book Made by Hong Kong has a lot of difficulties. It is too specialized in professional services. It needs to reindustrialize. It has no innovation capacity. The professors are great, but their technologies and knowledge are not transformed into commercialized products. The Hong Kong government also is too passive, and there got to be more proactive policies in order to facilitate the economic transformation to be a high-tech city. All right, so I don't have to tell you who won the debate. At the end, Hong Kong remained the same in terms of economic policy making, I would say, until recently. So I put Professor Louis' picture here because he's one of the people who have been arguing Hong Kong government needs to do more in sort of transforming its economy. At the top is Edward Chen, a famous economic professor, but he was actually former member of the Hong Kong Government Executive Council in the British colonial government. So a famous thing that he told me, Professor Chen told me, people have been misinterpreted misinterpreting the so-called non-interventionalist, right? Because he served in the British colonial Hong Kong government, so he knew that the old Hong Kong government was not taking sort of the non-interventionalist so seriously, right? So what they meant when they used that phrase is to provide the greatest support with the minimal intervention. But unfortunately, after 97, then several Hong Kong special administrative region government thought the best practice is actually not to intervene and allow the free markets to blossom, right? The market is always right. Sometimes the market failure, but most of the time, given Hong Kong's small economic status, the Hong Kong government should not intervene, or so-called they should adopt the small government, big market economic policy philosophy. And I think something is related to what Professor Lui has been talking about in terms of the political debate in town, and that is people have been too concerned about changes. And as Deng Xiaoping has said, there should be no change for 50 years. So therefore, people kept remembering those British colonial government economic philosophy, like small government, big market, and therefore, even in terms of economic policy debate, no one has ever, at least vocally, mentioned that something has to be done, all right? Because no change is probably better. Status quo is the safest thing for this city. So let me just go directly to my recommendation. And again, I'm an academic. I probably sound a bit naive to the policymakers, especially Professor Chang, who has served in the Hong Kong government for a while. First, and the most important, is to have a change in mindset, which I've already mentioned. There are downsides of small government, big market approach, and even in the West, right? If you look at the US or many continental European countries, they have been talking about reindustrialization. They have been talking about the need for the government to be more engaged in planning the economies or in restructuring the economies. So the so-called neoliberal order are actually changing their mind, and they are no longer advocating the so-called Washington consensus economic approaches to the rest of the world. The second, I think Hong Kong is not short of capital. It is, in fact, not short of land. It is just short of usable land, and I'm going to come back to it in the Q&A. But the biggest challenge for Hong Kong in terms of its economic transformation is it is short of the right kind of talents, right? In universities, I can tell you, I have a lot of academically achieved students choosing majors based on economic returns, right? And the highest paying jobs are in finance, in medical services, and in legal services. So the law schools, the business schools, and the medical schools got the most academically achieved students, right? I'm not saying that those non-academically unachieved students are not going to be the future of Hong Kong, but they got into the departments of engineering and sciences. They don't see the future, so they're not motivated to study or to acquire the right kind of skills. So in order to solve this shortage of talent problem, especially Beijing wants Hong Kong to be the innovation hub in the world, I think it is more important to create good jobs and therefore to create the right kind of labor demand for the young people. Some of them are still studying in universities or high schools. So how to solve the labor demand problem? There's only one shortcut, given that Hong Kong is a small open economy like Singapore. Attract big multinational firms to establish their affiliates in Hong Kong, right? It can be from mainland China, it can be from the rest of the world. Probably quite challenging to do it, given the geopolitical tension, especially if we are thinking about getting US companies to establish in Hong Kong. But I'm not pessimistic because if you pay attention on the news, Moderna, one of the most important vaccine researching institution and producer, have already announced that they're going to set up an affiliate in Hong Kong, hiring over 1,000 people, right? We need more companies like that, right? High-tech companies, with big multinational brand names to come to Hong Kong, right? We need more than just Disneyland, right? Disneyland is great, probably create a lot of jobs. I'm not sure whether those are good jobs, but we need big companies coming to Hong Kong to establish good jobs. And then, students will, go to the right department and work hard and study the right kind of knowledge and contribute to Hong Kong's economic transformation. And last but not least, as Professor Lui has mentioned, I think Hong Kong needs reindustrialization. This term has been introduced by C.Y. Liang, who was the chief executive of Hong Kong. But I don't think we have enough discussions about what types of industries that Hong Kong needs to get into and how that Hong Kong can be reindustrialized, right? So there have been expectations, there have been targets, but how to get from zero to that is the question that is unanswered. So, I bravely got into this challenging task. I thought, someone should kickstart the process, the thinking process. So first of all, I think Hong Kong should be Switzerland in the sense that it should focus on high value added products. It should focus on R&D intensive supply chains. Given its small geographic and population size, it should not be thinking about mass production, but it should get into the right high-tech ecosystem, either in the upstream or in the downstream. There should be more R&D, there should be more production of prototypes, there should be more testing. And once we get from 0 to 1, if those products are successful, then we find a place to mass produce it from 1 to 100 or 1 million, okay? And there are a lot of technologies that have not been promoted in Hong Kong, right? I've been working very closely to HKPZ. I learned a lot about what kind of technologies that are available, right? Internet of Things, robotics, AI, big data, how to make Hong Kong to be smart, right? As a smart city, also as a smart production economy, things that we have to continue to think hard about. And why is reindustrialization important and good for Hong Kong? Well, first of all, it will increase job diversity. And second, it will also increase job upward mobility, right? So if you don't believe in me, Danny Roderick at Harvard has written tons of papers talking about why we need good jobs, but not just jobs, right? We should not just focus on unemployment rate. We should focus on good job employment rate. Second, as Enrico Moretti, a UC Berkeley economist, has said, high-tech manufacturing sectors can generate a lot of positive externalities to multiple sectors, right? To education, to professional services, and even to low-skill services. Third, the reason why we need reindustrialization is it will strengthen connection between education, research, and industrial production, right? So this ecosystem has been discussed a lot in mainland China, and now the US government also talking about this, right? They're also realizing that there's a disconnect between education, especially in universities, and the rest of the economy. And finally, I think if we want Hong Kong to be more integrated with GBA, Hong Kong needs to think about how to harness those connections between research, high-tech manufacturing, as well as education. So I have finished a project for the Hong Kong Productivity Council. In the project, I talk about what kind of policies the Hong Kong government should think about. There are case studies about 3 countries, Singapore, Switzerland, and Israel, which are remarkably similar to Hong Kong in terms of its GDP per capita and population and geographic size. And there's no reason, as Professor Low said, Hong Kong cannot achieve a higher share of manufacturing. And what kind of sectors that we need? I think given Hong Kong competitive advantage, given Hong Kong's position in the world, given Hong Kong integration with the GPA as well as the rest of Asia, I think these are the 5 sectors, which include health tech, pharmaceutical, health supplements, medical devices, food tech. Hong Kong people love to eat, and there are great restaurants and food producers, but they're not using the right kind of technologies, and they're not doing enough R&D. Third, green tech. This is a challenge that all the big cities, especially a populated one, are facing. Fourth, agri-tech, not only because we're short of vegetables whenever we shut down a border between Hong Kong and mainland China, but because there are actually a lot of abundant industrial buildings where there have been some vertical farming producing high value added, high price organic vegetables exported to the rest of the world, and more can be done. Fifth, this is the most provocative. I think Hong Kong can be a semiconductor hub. There are enough multinational semiconductor companies, including the one in Shanghai, that have been looking at Hong Kong, especially in the Hetao, right? So the area that is going to be the next science park. There should be land allowing those companies to come to establish and affiliate. What they have told me is they need electricity, they need land, and they need water. And for the rest, meaning human and physical capital, they will bring in, right? And it's not going to be a lot of money, based on my discussions with them. Professor Low talked about RCEP. I'm not going to repeat. I think the geographical position of Hong Kong, which is exactly in the middle of the sand glass, right? You have in the north, mainland China, Japan, and South Korea. In the south, ASEAN plus Australia, New Zealand. There should be more trade flows through Hong Kong from the north to the south of the RCEP region. But Hong Kong should leverage the RCEP opportunities in order to turn it into more productive and more profitable centers, right? So it can continue to be an offshore RMB center. It can continue to provide the legal support for the RCEP members. There will be a lot of data flows because trade in the 21st century is going to generate a lot of data. There will be cross-border e-commerce. Hong Kong should take advantage to be the big data center given its good telecommunication infrastructure and relatively speaking, free internet. Finally, what are the specific policies? I think Hong Kong should think more strategically about how to integrate with the Greater Bay Area. There have been quite a lot of upstream activities happening in Hong Kong that can be more integrated with the downstream or midstream activities in Shenzhen, Dongguan, and other GBA cities. Universities should try to relax some of the restrictions, allow more research findings to be commercialized. And Hong Kong should not only focus on mainland China and GBA. Of course, those are the important market. But then, the rest of Asia, in particular ASEAN, as Professor Low has mentioned, will provide a lot of opportunities for Hong Kong companies as well. I've already mentioned, how Hong Kong should attract more high-tech FDI. You should also try to invest more in cultivating the right kind of talents. You should provide more suitable land for new economic activities. It should also promote advanced production technologies and turn Hong Kong into a smart city, and also turn Hong Kong to be a big data hub. Finally, let me say I am still optimistic despite the headwinds that I described. If you look at the startup space, there have been a lot more startups coming out in the last few years. They have not been scaled up, but some of them were quite successful already. SenseTime, Lalamove, GoGoVan, they're all unicorns. And when you look at Lalamove, for example, they're actually expanding crazy in Southeast Asia, in particular Indonesia, right? A Hong Kong company looking at ASEAN rather than mainland China. Of course, they already had a big presence in mainland China. In terms of infrastructure, there have been quite a lot of new buildings since Science Park and Singapore were built. There's a new data center in Zhangjiu now. There's an InnoCell, which is essentially high quality apartments for junior to mid-level foreign high-tech expats who do not need to live in very expensive apartments. And then there will be a new advanced manufacturing center going to be open this year. So Beijing wants Hong Kong to be 8 international centers. Some of them should be achievable, like International Finance Hub, as well as Offshore RMB Center. But in terms of innovation and technology hub, I think, given the mandate, Hong Kong should leverage on all the policy support from Beijing and take advantage of its existing advantages, as well as what GBA can offer. I remain slightly optimistic that this Northern Metropolis, as announced by our Chief Executive, Carrie Lam, last year, because Hong Kong is actually a lack of construction capacity, right? I don't have to tell you what happened in the last few months, right? As long as the construction capacity is back, including perhaps allowing some mainland short-term construction workers to come, then this Northern Metropolis can potentially be built in the next 10 years. Otherwise, this is just basically a ambitious blueprint which will never be achieved. But conditional on this being built in the next 10 years, I do think that it will create a new tech zone or a potential new CBD for Hong Kong, which is going to be great, right? You don't need people to be all going to Central to work and all going to the rest of Hong Kong to get into those low-paying jobs. All right, let me stop here. I probably talked too much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tang, and thanks again for speakers. Very, very stimulating ideas and insights. And also, of course, our friends in the audience, you are most welcome to raise questions or make comments, and we would address them later on. But I'm taking the privilege of being the moderator. I would like to kickstart the discussion, perhaps by throwing out a couple of questions to our speakers, and then later on, we would pick up more questions from the audience. Maybe fresh from Professor Tang's presentation, that I would like to follow up by asking the questions that what you have just argued, of course, is something very forceful and promising, but at the same time, it seems to be dependent on two major things. One, it would be the sort of mindset that you mentioned. It's not just about whether the government play a role or not, but more importantly, is our government ready to make bold statements. For example, like what you said, if you want to have impact right away in very short term, and then you recreate a new ecosystem for innovation and competitiveness, then perhaps you should focus on bringing in non-local investments into Hong Kong, so that there would be a breakthrough, and then there would be momentum and scale and so on. So you're talking about Moderna, other firms coming in from all parts of the world, from China and so on. But that would require a kind of big narrative that probably the government would be too shy to raise that kind of narrative. And at the same time, sometimes what I find quite intriguing is that our government sometimes short of big words, but at the same time, they are not quite attentive enough to the nitty-gritties. For example, when I was reading your report on reindustrialization, one of the very interesting points that I noticed is that a lot of your respondents saying that I'm not looking for a bigger size factory or premises, but instead I'm looking for having a taller ceiling. I need to have a taller building to raise the ceiling level so that I can install automation machines and so on. It sounds to be something, it's something very tangible, but at the same time, if we dare to go out to the field, then you would collect this kind of information right away, and so that you would recreate a new infrastructure for innovation. But definitely, a lot of time that you find people still talking about bigger size, new premises instead of really looking into the needs of the entrepreneurs and the innovative firms. So mindsets in terms of big narratives and the smaller details. For Professor Low, again, I really appreciate all your ideas and you're throwing out a very important agenda for Hong Kong. But when I was listening to your presentation right away, I would say, okay, but still Hong Kong need to compete with other competitors in order to take up that role. And of course, that I immediately think about Singapore. If Singapore can also reach out and connect with Greater Bay areas, and then of course Singapore has a very strong profile in ASEAN countries. So in what way Hong Kong would be able to compete with Singapore to play that role? I mean, definitely we want to play that role, but can we outpit our competitors, or are we ready for that? And for Professor Cheung, Anthony, towards the end of your presentation, of course, you raised several very important points on relaunching Hong Kong. But one of the tricky things about being part of Greater Bay Area, and also as if we are not exactly Greater Bay Area, is the tricky thing that if you really want to work out the processes as well as the major breakthroughs, sometimes you really need to have the kind of political skills and tactfulness. For example, some of the issues would need to be addressed at the city level, municipal level, but sometimes it's a provincial level agenda. And so far, I'm still not convinced that the Hong Kong SAR government have the kind of skill and knowledge to maneuvering between provincial government, municipal government, and so that a lot of time that some of the big words belongs to Beijing or belong to Guangzhou at the provincial level. what you need to do is to make use of the space and to implement it and to do it. But at the same time, you need to convince the higher level government so that they would put the right words into the document paper so that you can push for that sort of change. But for me, I mean, I've seen the SAR government for more than 20 years. That still, I don't see a lot of that kind of skill and tactfulness in the actual implementation of Hong Kong's major projects. I may be too pessimistic on that point, but I throw these questions to you. Okay. So, AY or Donald, you like to?
Yeah, I can start first. So about the mindset change, this is the most important, I think, or the sort of the prerequisite, right? If government officials, politicians, and by the way, ordinary Hong Kong citizens do not think that Hong Kong's economy needs to be transformed into a more industrialized and more high-tech city, then forget about it. And then another important mindset change is the Hong Kong government should think about how to work with the private sector more strategically, right? It's not to keep a distance from them, right? I mean, I understand, the sensitivity of being too engaged with them, like some of the commonly heard accusations about, their involvement with the real estate developers. But I think, there got to be a better balance between the state and the market. And I believe, Professor Low will agree with me, given what he has seen in Singapore. So that has to be changed. And, when I talk to some, I shouldn't mention their names, but relatively senior government officials in the Hong Kong government, I still got the impression that they believe that, the market is right and, letting the market decide what is good. And sometimes I will hear directly saying, well, we are not Singapore, we don't have a military, we are not a country, so therefore we don't need to think about, those kind of long-term economic policy planning. So it is actually quite shocking to me, right? Upright rejection to a proposal that may suggest Hong Kong to be more involved in planning its economy. On the second part, I think more information is needed about what the industrialists need. And because of my project with HKPC and other research institutes, I got a chance to talk to a lot of them. Some of them are second or third generation industrialists. Their father or grandfather started a business and they still inherited that. Many of them still wanted to expand their business in mainland China, but also in Hong Kong, by the way. And some of them actually have very good heart, saying, well, they also want to create jobs for the young people. And they believe that, with the right environment and policy support, they can do that. So there's another place where the Hong Kong government and the policymakers can try to do, right? Maybe talk to them more and understand their needs. And as you said, Professor Lui, according to my report, Hong Kong is not short of land, but it's short of the right kind of land. And many of those old industrial buildings that were essentially built in the 70s were obsolete, right? They are not suitable for today's Industry 4.0 activities, right? So someone has to make a decision about what to do with those buildings, and not to keep arguing, saying, well, we have buildings for you guys, why don't you go to those places to re-industrialize? But I think, in recent years, right, and I have to give credit to the current government on the reindustrialization effort. There have been quite a lot of investment in new infrastructure. And I think Hong Kong government, after the previous one mentioning reindustrialization, realized we need new buildings like AMC, Advanced Manufacturing Center, and as well as a big data center. I remain very optimistic on that, right? In the next 5 years, we're going to see a lot of new technology centers being built. The question is whether there will be enough firms going in to occupy them. Yeah, let me stop here.
Okay, thank you. Donald?
Thanks very much, Professor Liu, for your question. And thanks, AY, for a fantastic talk. Actually, I think Hong Kong shouldn't sell itself short in thinking about how it can play a much more involved role in Southeast Asia and be this bridge, this conduit between the GBA and mainland and Southeast Asia. I don't think it should sell itself short vis-a-vis Singapore. yes, of course, there are certain things that Singapore does better than Hong Kong, not least, as KY was saying, the more activist role, the more supportive role of the state. But Hong Kong also has some advantages over Singapore. One is, of course, Hong Kong's links with the mainland and Hong Kong's position within the Greater Bay Area. That's something Singapore will never have. Right? Singapore is a great conduit between the West, particularly American and to some extent European MNCs, into Southeast Asia. But Singapore will never be able to replicate what Hong Kong can do as a conduit from the mainland to Southeast Asia. So that's a unique advantage that Hong Kong has that Singapore doesn't have. Second, Singapore doesn't really have a strong, vibrant local entrepreneurship scene. Yes, in recent years, we've seen a very conducive startup environment, and some Singaporeans have gone into that. But the tradition of entrepreneurship, of the private sector starting up its own enterprises and moving into, that simply does not exist in Singapore. Singapore is mostly an economy that is dominated by multinationals and government-linked companies, what we would call state-owned enterprises. Hong Kong is inherently a more bottom-up, entrepreneurial, private sector-led economy. So in that sense, Hong Kong is more flexible, more agile, more entrepreneurial in a way that Singapore will never be. Right? Singapore is still very much a top-down, somewhat not centrally planned, but a much more planned economy. That has some advantages, as Haywire was saying. But Hong Kong shouldn't sell itself short, right? If government can provide the right support, the right conducive environment, can provide the right taxes and regulatory spaces, Hong Kong's entrepreneurship I believe, can quite easily be regained and rediscovered. And third, Hong Kong's capital markets are much more developed than Singapore. Right? Hong Kong is a much bigger market for capital raising. You look at the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, is much larger than Singapore's ever will be. Again, this reflects that the relative roles of market and government. Singapore is big governments, smaller markets. Hong Kong is the opposite. So I think Hong Kong should play up its strengths, right? And with the right strategic, as Haywire was suggesting, the right strategic investments and participation of the state, right? But still letting private sector take the lead, because that's Hong Kong's comparative advantage. I think, Hong Kong will not pale in comparison to Singapore. And finally, Southeast Asia is massive, right? We're talking about 600 million economy. That's going to be the world's fourth largest economy if we treat Southeast Asia as a single economy. Singapore is 5.5 million people. Hong Kong is 7.5 million people. There's more than enough opportunities in Southeast Asia where both of us can exploit. So it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, and I don't think it is a zero-sum game. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, my turn. I think, Dialogue, I agree fully with you that Hong Kong has to be competent in terms of dealing with, broadly speaking, politics of the mainland, given that we are integrating further into the mainland, especially within the GBA context. I think we have some basic skills, but these skills are not enough. For example, take the GBA document, the planning document as example. Now, in the document, you find that the central government undertakes to support Hong Kong in this, Macau in that, or Shenzhen in this and that. Now, the process of coming up with the document actually involves inputs from various cities. And looking at the document itself, because I've been involved in the early stage of the GBA document formulation process, I think Hong Kong has got what it has always wanted. In other words, recognizing Hong Kong's strengths, financial services, aviation, Hong Kong aspiring to be a regional dispute resolution center and all that. I can detect that all those that Hong Kong wanted are there. And then the central government is very skillful in terms of describing Hong Kong and describing Shenzhen and the others, because there are sensitivities. Macau too, you notice that Macau is very keen on emphasizing its linkage to the Portuguese-speaking world. But now, if you look at the document as an illustration, I think what Hong Kong lacks is we have been unable to provide the Hong Kong input to visionary articulation. We are very pragmatic. We want Hong Kong to be a dispute resolution center. We want Hong Kong to continue to be an aviation hub. Very pragmatic level. But in terms of articulating Hong Kong's mission overall, how Hong Kong can integrate with the national vision, maybe at that level, I don't think we have been up to it so far. And that brings me to the other point about political competence, having heard what Donald and Hayward has said. Because Donald, you mentioned COVID-19 as an example of the sort of failure of government in dealing with the challenge competence. I would broadly say that this is lack of political competence. It's not just government. I mean, if you look at our EdUHK, the politicians, maybe they have also failed. And that kind of, but we have to go behind the lack of competence. Why? And I could identify a few. Too rigid, too risk averse. Now, these are not the features, they were not the features of Hong Kong in the old days. Actually, the can-do spirit, they try to overcome dogmatic thinking. But right now, we find that we have been more bound by dogmatic reaction or dogmatic articulation. We have become victim of past success. We have not been able to adjust our protocols in dealing with COVID cases, for example. And therefore, we have allowed our system to be overwhelmed. And the government has few supporters. I think this is a reality. And of course, we can say, well, we've been through 2019, and then after 2019, the central government has come up with some remedies. But then we have to ask, I mean, if we have to be very honest, we have to ask, have those remedies helped to solve the problems? Or sometimes some of those remedies have exacerbated the problems. In other words, are we really addressing the problems exposed? And I feel that we are not really addressing those problems that have been imposing hurdles on us. So if we don't address the real problems, then maybe despite all the good wishful thinking, I think we may not be able to overcome the challenges. And one last point about where we stand, given the problems we have identified, given what we aspire to be, given the prospect that could be provided by GBA and all that. I think we are now facing a crisis of the 3 I's. Innovation. We know innovation is important, but how do we deal with innovation? And I think it's not just innovation in terms of nurturing some innovation-related industries or introducing more element in innovation. At the end of the day, innovation has to do with the whole society, the government. Are we innovative? Are we able to be the first who tries this and that? Now, in the past, in some circumstances, Hong Kong was willing to be the first. But increasingly, I find that we always look to others. Oh, this is how Singapore has done it. This is how Shenzhen has done it. So that this is safe. So we go in the same way. Are we able to be the first comer, so to speak? Secondly, international. Are we still international? I think all 3 of us have talked about that to some extent. So that's another challenge. We cannot assume that we will continue to be very international. And thirdly, the intermediation role, reindustrialization. So the 3 I's, I think, perhaps can provide the keywords to the rather paradoxical or the crisis situation we are now in.
Okay. Well, maybe I take this opportunity to read out a couple of questions from the audience. This probably are questions to Donald and Hayward. It's does the current government have the staff and expertise to connect more closely with ASEAN countries? probably you two can address that, and not exactly a related question, but I think it's sort of come up in the discussion in the presentation by Anthony as well as Haywire. It's are we not undervaluing Hong Kong's contribution to the Greater Bay Area by not properly recognizing its offshore manufacturing industries, which is increasingly moving up the technology chain? Well, I personally have seen cases that have done visits to Hong Kong manufacturers that they quite long ago moved to Pearl River Delta, and then later on move on to ASEAN countries like Cambodia and so on. And in fact, they have been changing their production and sometimes also enhance their technological sophistication. So, but somehow, because it's fall out of the picture of the Hong Kong map, so sometimes we don't really count them. So I think this is a comment on whether we have undervaluing or underestimated our strength in that area. We start with these two comments first.
Yeah, maybe I'll take the one. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think it's, and as Professor Cheong also has highlighted, the Hong Kong's bureaucratic capacity, the capacity of its bureaucracy is actually not low. When you look at whatever rankings of governmental capacity, Hong Kong, it's not, I mean, maybe not as high as Singapore's, but it's still in the top 10%, top 20%. So I don't think it's an issue of capacity or expertise. It's really what Professor Cheong mentioned just now, right? Whether government wants to play a facilitating role, right? What you also, Professor Liu mentioned, right? The kind of issues that businesses in Hong Kong face tend to be issues around, your rules are a bit too rigid. Can you be more pro-business? Which is ironic, right? We would assume the Hong Kong state, the Hong Kong government to be very pro-business. But I agree, right? Having been in Hong Kong, I find the Hong Kong government surprisingly to be quite bureaucratic, quite rigid. Whereas the Singapore government, in relation to dealing with, when dealing with foreign investments and multinationals, really lays out the red carpet. Really will bend over backwards, not just to attract them, but when they attract them, they make sure they have access to foreign workers, make sure that they have all the right regulatory exemptions or support, tax incentives set up nicely, land is prepared, right? So it's really a very integrated whole of government approach to attracting the kind of investment Singapore wants to attract. And I don't get that sense in Hong Kong, right? Where, investment promotion is seen, oh, this is just a job of marketing, right? This is just a marketing job. When in fact, it really has to be a whole of bureaucracy effort to make multinationals not just welcome in Hong Kong, but they can succeed in Hong Kong, right? And succeed in going to the mainland, succeed in going to Southeast Asia. Hong Kong is your base camp, right? It's your base for you to reach out to the world. And in those areas where Haywire talked about green tech, food tech, agri-tech, I think the government really has to reposition itself philosophically in terms of processes and protocols, and in really organizing itself, right? The Hong Kong, different parts of the Hong Kong government, organizing itself to say that Hong Kong is back in business and we want to work with enterprises from all over the world, enterprises that want to go to the mainland or enterprises that want to go to Southeast Asia. And we are your ideal home and hub for your operations. I think that's currently missing. Yeah.
So let me try to answer both questions at the same time. Donald, I think the question is about whether we have the expertise to connect with ASEAN. You touch on that, but I think there are actually a lot of people in Hong Kong in the private sector who have experience expanding their businesses in ASEAN, or some of them are actually originated from ASEAN. So the private sector has expertise. I cannot speak for the government. I don't know whether there are people who are involved in that, but as long as the city has talent, I'm not too concerned about that. On the second point, about our contribution to offshore manufacturing activities. Of course, Hong Kong is a city and economy that is very specialized in professional services. So, professional services are used in all sectors, manufacturing included. So our contribution to GBA has been huge, right? So there's still a lot of plants, manufacturing plants in Dongguan, Shenzhen, different part of Guangdong, they were established by Hong Kong industrialists and still owned by them. So if you count those contributions, it could be huge. But on this, I want to take the opportunity to highlight one thing. A lot of the government, Hong Kong included, had, I would say, too much emphasis on one KPI, and that is GDP or GDP growth. They tend not to look at productivity growth. They also tend not to develop economic policies based on job creation, right? So things are changing slowly in the United States, the place that I know a bit more because I lived there for a long time. But look at European nations, Germany in particular, and not to mention Scandinavian countries. Creating good jobs has always been, one of their KPI when they think about economic policies. This thing has been missing, I would say, right? I mean, I don't know whether the British colonial government, when they ruled Hong Kong, had that, but certainly I did not feel that, the current Hong Kong government and the previous several governments after '97 had put good job at a high priority when they come to when they think about economic policies. And so therefore, my response to that question is yes, in terms of value added, we probably have created a lot because of those offshore activities. But since all the jobs are gone, like what happened to the US, what kind of jobs do we still have in Hong Kong? And I repeat what I said about hollowing out of the middle class, right? We don't have those high mobility jobs. We have the very high-paying jobs in IFC, in the financial sector. Many of them, by the way, were done either by mainland Chinese, by expats, or by people who may be born and raised in Hong Kong, but they got a US or Europe education and come back, right? So we need to do something for the people here, right? Not only because this city has some social and economic tension, but also because I think those are good economic policies that every government should think harder about, given all the challenges that we face. All right, that's it.
Okay, just to add to what Hayward just said in relation to how Hong Kong adapt or responds to the changing circumstances, the new challenges. I think by now, most, including government and perhaps Hong Kong as a whole, agree that we are well beyond the previous stage of positive non-intervention. Even though in the mindset, there's still some remnants of that kind of thinking. But I think overall, we say, well, we are now proactive and so on and so forth. However, whether or not we are able to be proactive depends on other factors as well. Now, in the past, under positive non-interventionism, what government needed was, okay, you must have wisdom. You know where to intervene, how. But largely, broadly speaking, we try to rely on the market. That's why the importance of entrepreneurship. You allow the market to be flexible, to adapt, and then you sort of make sure that this works. And then at the strategic point, you intervene. And then you know how to intervene, and you try not to overburden yourself. Now that works until perhaps 20 odd years ago. Today, we are saying, well, we want government to be more proactive. It's similar to state developmentalism to some extent. However, a precondition for that is the government knows how to intervene. The government knows how to be proactive. The government knows how to be innovative. And the government has the tools to facilitate that. Now, Israel, Singapore, Hong Kong, I mean, in terms of official rhetoric, we all say, well, we try to be more proactive. We try to steer. I mean, in Hong Kong, we do not use the term steer, but in fact, it seems that that would be more desirable. But the question is our bureaucracy able to steer? Because they've been so used to not steering. Do they have the tools? Do they have the capacity, the sort of mental or the financial, the physical means? Now, what I can observe is over the last 1 to 2 decades, the way we steer most of the time is by way of giving you money. We set up funds, we give allocations. This is the old way. It's like you allow the market to do it. You just give money to support. Or sometimes through regulatory regulatory means, but sometimes regulatory means could also create hurdles. But then are we lacking certain capacities in terms of steering if we are really going into a more proactive government? So that's the question. And maybe I should also take the opportunity to address the last question raised by Sean about economic connections. I think unavoidably within the GBA, I mean for any city, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, or Guangzhou, Macau, we do have sort of differences with the others. Maybe Hong Kong and Macau more so vis-a-vis other PRD, other GBA cities. But even in terms of integration in Europe, the EU, for example, every member country is different. Or ASEAN, every Southeast Asian country is different. So cultural and political differences, differences in history, heritage, they are given. So in terms of integration, connectivity, we have to balance such differences with the desire to integrate. And that's why compatibility is so important, or complementarity is so important, or the willingness, the goodwill to work together. And that is not to be taken for granted. Of course, we have to nurture that kind of common goal or sort of a common vision. And so in other words, in terms of GBA, if Hong Kong really wants to excel in GBA, then we have to take up a rather proactive role. We cannot just let others define and then we just follow and then we just look for some opportunities. We have to have our own vision. And correct me if I'm wrong, Donald. I think in terms of ASEAN, actually Singapore has a very good, knows very well how to take ASEAN forward, even though Singapore is only a member of ASEAN, and maybe in terms of size, a smaller member state. But still, you need to have a vision. So the question to Hong Kong is, do we have a GBA vision? Or do we just sort of reactively respond to some developments within the GBA?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. And if I may add a footnote to your answer to that question is, if you look back in our previous development experience in the 1990s, when Hong Kong have a lot of overseas companies coming to Hong Kong, set up their regional offices here, and to coordinate a lot of activities in mainland China and perhaps even Taiwan and a little bit of Southeast Asia, is exactly that, they think that, Hong Kong people, because of our Chinese background, that's why we also know the sort of tricks of maneuvering in mainland. But at the same time, you also have the global awareness and knowledge of how to deal with the world economy and so on. So I don't think cultural difference would be a major hurdle. But then, of course, like what you said, probably we need more than that. You need a vision, you need the readiness to overcome some of the difficulties and challenges when we get further integrated and connected with the Greater Bay Area. Well, time is running out, but I still, what the one more question, I think probably that would be Haywai's question is, it's about how will communities, for example, Taipo here, would be affected by the transformation of industries in relation to sustainable development, low carbon communities, and so on. So maybe, Haywai, you can talk about reindustrialization, the type of industries that you have in mind or you think would be suitable for Hong Kong's future development. They are likely to be environmental friendly industries, right?
Yeah, so I want to take this moment in response to the question to say I am actually quite optimistic about Hong Kong, even though my slides paint a very negative picture. Because in the last few years, we started hearing a lot of encouraging, at least slogans, right? If not the actual policy changes, right? So the two most commonly discussed words in Hong Kong are ESG and fintech, right? You heard about them almost everywhere you go these days, right? To business conferences or academic conferences. And I think the Hong Kong government is quite serious about both, right? Especially in the financial sector. The HKMA, for example, has been trying to take the lead to be the Asian green financing hub or ESG hub or fintech hub, right? So those, I think, will happen, given Hong Kong existing financial talents and status. But in terms of the local situation, there have been a lot of challenges to do with like trash and all this, and that's the reason why in HAPZ proposal I mentioned green tech should be something that Hong Kong should think harder about and actually try to implement some actual policies. The Hong Kong government has been actively working on that, trying to create more recycling technologies as well as facilities. And when we look at the big blueprints for the Northern Metropolis, they have been talking about not only just high tech and reindustrialization, but also try to create an environment that is suitable for work, but also for living. So I think future urban planning will make Hong Kong greener and more suitable for living, rather than just a place to do business or make money. So on that, I think I'm quite optimistic. I'm less optimistic about how smart the city can be. I'm optimistic how green the city will be. In terms of the smart part of the city development, I think there are going to be more changes on the policy restrictions on data security and things like that.
Thanks, Hayward, and thanks to all three speakers. I think we have a lot to learn from you, and it will take time for us to digest, because there's a tall list. This is a tall agenda, and it requires not only the business sector but also the government as well as the academics actually to rework Hong Kong's agenda. Anthony used the word of relaunching, and definitely the challenge ahead of us would even be something more challenging than relaunching, because it really needs a change of mindset. It really needs to think about, do we really have the handles? Do we have the machines? Do we have the organizations to drive that kind of change, as well as knowledge for some very interesting reasons that, Hong Kong is never paying much attention to our competitors and never do a lot of research on finding out what they are doing and how we can outsmart them and so on and so forth. So for some unknown reason, we have been becoming a little bit of introvert in the past 2 decades, and it's about time for us to step out of the comfort zone, though it's no longer comfortable. And we really need to look at what happened and to address them one by one, and perhaps not only systematically, but also with overarching new framework in order to deal with all these issues. Once again, Donald, thanks so much. Hayward, thank you very much. And of course, Anthony has been driving our policy series throughout the whole year. And also thanks for the audience for following our series. And there will be another one coming up.
The 30th of April.
Okay, and so stay watching. Meanwhile, it's all from us here, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.